Tēnā koutou katoa, haere mai ki tēnei hui, ki te mana whenua rangitānei, he mihi nui, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Morning everyone and welcome to actually our first committee meeting of the year. We are having, in true fashion, a couple of little hiccups with getting some submitters online, so we might just be a little bit extra patient this morning. So our meeting is obviously being recorded. We do have online participants, both staff and members of our community, and we're currently streaming on YouTube. So under the red setting, we are obviously closed to the public, so we're encouraging people that to participate online. You're all familiar with our health and safety procedures in terms of evacuation, where our defibrillators kept, so we won't need to run through those. And I think that's it. So moving on to apologies, we have got an apology from Councillor Dennison. Are there any other apologies? Great, well I will move that apologies be received from Councillor Vaughan Dennison, seconded by Councillor Hancock, and I will invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. We haven't had notification of any additional items. Are there any declarations of interest? Great. We also haven't received any requests for public comment. So moving through the agenda, we are just swapping 5 and 6 around, and we will be hearing the submissions first. So we've got 3 submitters who I believe are now all online. So can we just check that Grant Bins is ready and available? We'll just hit pause for a moment, Grant, and get you up on the main screen. So we've got 10 minutes for submissions. You can take your submission as read and use your 10 minutes how you wish. If you would like to take any questions, then you'll just need to factor that into your 10 minutes. And we do have a timer running here, which of course you can't see, so we'll just let you know when you need to start wrapping up if we're heading towards the end of that 10 minutes. So, councillors, this is submission number 4 on the draft Stormwater Bylaw and page 24. Grant, can you take yourself off mute and just give us a hello so we can check the sound?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay.
You can start when you're ready.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yes, my name is Grant Bins. I have a New Zealand certificate in civil engineering and I'm a registered engineering associate. I've been around in the Manawatu for quite some time and probably some people would say far too long. The bulk of my experience has been with drainage, and in the last few years I've also worked in both the building and property development industries. Stormwater issues in the city aren't new, and they've been ever increasing over the last few years, especially with the influx of infill housing. And I'm not against stormwater attenuation. In fact, I believe it's a great idea, but it needs to be done properly and it needs to be well engineered and properly thought through. I don't know if you people will be able to see this, but I've brought some guidelines as to what actually happens, and hopefully you'll be able to follow my logic. This is an 80mm downpipe. It's common on most houses, and around the house network you'll have a stormwater pipe, and basically the downpipe drains into the stormwater pipe. You can see there's a little bit of a difference in size. That stormwater network heads off out into the street and will run into a much bigger pipe and away. With these attenuation devices, you put a tank in the middle and then you drain them either through a 20mm pipe, which just fell out, or in some cases a 15mm pipe. So you can see there's quite a severe restriction on what actually happens to the water coming off your roof, and in some cases off hard stand areas and the like. And of course, in most roof spouting systems, you collect leaves and other debris, which then ends up in your tank, even if you've got a diverter, a waste diverter on there. And that tends to make the system extremely unreliable, in my view anyway. Basically, council has been allowing infill housing throughout the city, and in a lot of areas where stormwater infrastructure has already been unable to cope with the existing volumes, let alone that created by the new infill projects. In my view, council has already passed the buck on to the landowner by forcing them to install attenuation tanks. Council now wants to pass on the performance of their entire network to these landowners as well. The landowner gets no benefit from these tanks at all. They are 100% for the benefit of the council network. But unfortunately, the landowner has to pay to install them. And that can be anywhere from $2,500 for a relatively small tank on a simple install, up to $10,000 plus if the tank has to be buried. The tank also impacts on site coverage. So if you happen to be on the wrong end of the stick with the calculations, you could lose something even the size of a bedroom on your new house just purely to accommodate an attenuation tank of some other device. Now, according to these bylaws, people are going to have to make sure that they maintain these tanks, so they're going to have to pay for them, which is an added cost. And in some cases, people won't be able to do that work. They're going to have to get somebody in to do it. And my other concern with these tanks is the insurance issues. If you've got a series of tanks upstream and they all happen to block all at the same time and there's downstream flooding, while the insurance council can't take the council to court, can they take a private landowner for failing to maintain a system? So that's a question I've got for the council. I also note that the document supplied by council so far has been very short on what the council are going to mean by maintenance. How often, what sort, who can do it, how do you prove it's been done if you can do it yourself? What about the cost if you can't do it yourself? And of course, do you need to clean the roof and the spouting all at the same time? And of course, some of these new stormwater attenuation tanks in particular are non-man entry. They're not big enough. Some of them are only 250 millimetres wide, 1.8 metres long and 1.8 metres high. They're designed to fit on a fence. Unfortunately, here in Palmerston North, you can't use them as fence replacements because they're not fire rated in general, and council won't accept them. So if you've got a non-man entry tank, that's one way, one very difficult piece to clean. If you've got man entry tanks, because it's a confined space, well, you need confined space certification to actually get in there and clean it out. Going forward, I also have issues with reliability in the future, changes in climate, hotter weather, water restrictions, water meters, and people have a storage tank on site which is empty. It could be a good solution to save some money or save some planting. I think the ratepayers already contribute to the maintenance of the city stormwater network, and because council now consider an attenuation tank an essential part of the city council network, the ratepayers who have these tanks on their property will now pay more rates than the people who don't have a tank. Plus, they also have the added responsibility that they have to maintain that portion of the city network on their property. I really struggle to see how this can actually be seen as fair. A better solution is tanks or larger pipes installed in the road reserve or perhaps in local council reserves, or at least some other form of engineered solution that will work, that will be reliable. And I note in the new developments south of town, down in the Te Wanaka Road area, that council are looking to use stormwater ponds and things engineered into the development so that the individual homeowners won't require detention devices. I think that's wonderful if it can be engineered in and a really good solution. In short, I believe council need to actually spend money on the existing essential network that they've got. They need to make it work so it's doing what it's supposed to do for all ratepayers, rather than passing the buck on to a few ratepayers by developing new bylaws and then having people have to have inspections and the like to make sure that things are maintained. Thanks for listening, and I'm really keen to see if anybody's got any questions.
Thanks for your submission, Grant. I've got one question. In regards to the comments you've made around significant additional costs for the household, if they were to maintain, do you see that as quite a bit different from general household maintenance, such as, clearing out your gutters on a somewhat regular basis, or water blasting the section, or any of those kind of things? Do you see this as quite a significantly different piece of maintenance?
Yeah, I do. It'll depend on the type of tank. For example, if you've got a non-man entry tank, then you're going to need somebody with a water blaster and a vacuum extraction system to vacuum out the debris in the bottom of the tank. So it's not something the homeowner's going to be able to do. The only other option would be to take the tank out, try and flush it all out and tip it out through the exit hole or the entry hole, which means disconnecting the pipework, etc., etc. Some people will be able to do that, but I suspect probably not a lot. Man entry tanks, my big concern is I believe that they will be confined space entry. they're only going to have a 600mm hole at the top. If that, you'll need a ladder to get into them because most of them are over 1.5 meters deep. And again, for the average Joe Blow to get in there, if he doesn't know what he's doing, if he's not careful, he could get into trouble, especially more elderly people as well, like myself probably.
I guess my question was more around, you know, if we take something like chimney sweeping, for example, some people do that themselves and some people will get someone in to do that every year or however often they do that. And so is this something that could potentially just jump onto a typical maintenance cycle for households, or do you see that actually, you know, cost or other things would mean that this is a significantly different piece of maintenance to you getting your chimney swept out?
Okay, I think you'll have to do it more often if you're going to keep those 15 or 20mm pipes open and working.
Okay.
I mean, I've just taken down a 6-metre tree on the front of my property simply because it fills up my spouting about 4 times a year.
Okay, thank you, you've answered that. Councillor Barrett.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Grant. Just wanted to ask, you talked about how some residents have to have these detention facilities and obviously some don't. Would you be supportive of the idea that those that do have the detention facilities then receive some sort of rates discount or rates differential that recognized the extra burden on those owners?
Well, I think that's probably, that's a partial solution to the cost. I still believe that a detention tank is a flawed mechanism for doing what you're trying to do. It's basically, it can't be 100% reliable. And as soon as that outlet blocks, the tank fills, overflows, and you have absolutely no detention at all. So your system then runs at original design flow off the roof. If you have 3 or 4 doing that, you've probably got enough to have a flood if your system's relying on those tanks actually working.
Thanks, Grant. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your submission, Grant. Your time is concluded now. So moving on to the next submission, we've got Chris Teoshrell. This is submission number 3 and page 21. And there was also an additional image circulated yesterday to be tabled in support of the submission.
Image circulated yesterday to be tabled.
We've got a bit of feedback coming through from our participants online. Can we just make sure that once you've finished speaking, if you could just pop yourself onto mute? Chris, you are able to start your submission when you're ready.
Chris.
Do you want to just check you've taken yourself off mute, Chris?
Alicia, did you say something?
Do you want to just check you've taken yourself off mute, Chris?
It says I'm off mute.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. We've got a bit of a delay with you coming through, so you can start when you're ready, and we'll just try to manage the technology.
We've got a bit of a delay with you coming through, so you can start when you're ready, and we'll just try to manage the.
Okay, thanks very much, Alicia. Hope everybody had a pleasant holiday and has been enjoying the super hot weather we've been getting. Stormwater. We had a bit at the weekend, and we're probably going to have some more at the coming weekend. The concern that I'd like to emphasise with you is the extent of hard surface that is increasing around the city. The image that I sent through and has been distributed to you yesterday was just of a fairly typical case, and certainly by no means the worst case that I've seen around the city. There was still some soft surface left. But repeatedly I see, mostly with infill, but not exclusively, not only is there increased roof area over the original land area when there's 2 or 3 buildings put on them, but also there's all the additional driveway, and then this tendency for even more hard surfaces to be created, sometimes covered over with fake grass and the likes of that. And although I'm informed that there is a stormwater management plan that addresses this issue for new subdivisions, and I think the previous speaker was speaking to an aspect of that, the requirement for detention devices of some sort. It also should apply to existing brownfield areas rather than just greenfield, where the infill is occurring. And actually not even just with infill, because although those stormwater management guidelines, and I think there's something else called a stormwater framework that's in the pipeline, so to speak, those only address the issue when there is a building consent in question. Once all that has been signed off, people seem able to do whatever they want. If they want to tar seal over their front yards to provide themselves with more parking or a tennis court or whatever, there seems to be no potential for control of that whatsoever. So I think, there should be haste made in completing that stormwater management guidelines and the stormwater framework. I can remember back to my early days there, we were raising, various councillors raised the issue of hard surfaces probably as far back as 2008, 2009. And still, it seems to me that we're in the same situation, at least from what I see on the ground, the increase in hard surfaces that I see. And it seems to me that there are plenty of options, not only the detention tank that was mentioned by the previous speaker, but also just increasing the areas or maintaining the areas of soft surfaces. I think there is what is it, it's called a built area ratio or something like that, but that only seems to apply to the roof area. It doesn't include the driveway and patios and decks and any other areas that are sealed over, and I think they should. But so there's also detention ponds that could be used. Of course, if the rain goes on for hours and hours and pours, then eventually those will be overloaded as well. But that's really the case with any measure. Any measure will have a limit with which it can cope. I think the principle of not allowing new developments to discharge more stormwater than already occurs off the land is a good one. I disagree with the previous speaker's point that it should just be the council that deals with this by providing adequately sized piping and so on. I'm familiar with the expense of that, but also we may also be reaching a limit in the volume that can be coped with practically on any sort of piping system or ditch system that's put in. So I think it is time that the costs do shift to private landowners. Some landowners, in fact most still, maintain soft areas around their property, and they shouldn't be supporting those who insist on sealing most of their properties. Porous concrete's another way that I forgot to mention a moment ago is a way that can be used to help address the issue. So that's probably the first thing I'd like to say. The second one relates to the last paragraph of my submission, paragraph 14, about education and enforcement. I still regularly see contaminants entering the roadside channel, coming out of people's stormwater system. So clearly some people are pouring things down their stormwater system pipes or going out to the street and dumping it in the street. I think there still needs to be a lot more education. Many people don't realise that stormwater goes straight to the streams and river. Many people still believe that it goes to the treatment plant, but in any case, putting paint even into the treatment plant system is completely inappropriate. So I think Council really needs to continue educating about that, but also to up its enforcement and encourage people to report instances of contaminants being put into that system. Finally, the point I raised in paragraphs 9 and 10 about allowing people to build over stormwater pipes. I think that's just creating a future problem. Pipes eventually deteriorate, collapse, and if that's the case, they'll need to be replaced or repaired. Doing so under buildings is, I think, necessarily much trickier than doing so out away from buildings. So I think that provision of the proposed bylaws should be scrapped, and that all new buildings should have to ensure that the building footprint does not overlay any stormwater pipes that are underground. Those are the points I wish to make. Thanks very much. I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Chris. Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chris, for a detailed...
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chris, for a detailed
presentation. Yeah, my question is about your paragraph 14. Obviously, you are not satisfied about the level of education about this problem. On what level do you think this education should be, and what sort of what means you think can be more effective in teaching people these things?
And what means you think can be more effective in teaching people these things?
Thanks, Sofika. These days, you really have to cover all your bases because different groups of people in society get their information from different sources, and it's very, very fractured. No one medium has an overwhelming patronage, so you really have to cover all sorts of things like community newspapers and daily newspapers and radio and social media and the council's website and rates notices and the works basically, and probably at events like Esplanade Day and Multicultural Day and things like that, and maybe even just going out to places where lots of people congregate, like the arena and the plaza and so forth, and demonstrating various aspects. Some people relate much better to seeing things than to the written or spoken word. So I really think you need to cover a whole range of things. But I've been in some other places where this idea that stormwater doesn't get further treated is driven home continuously by signs of fish right next to the drainage sumps on the road, and I've also seen signs up in parks and things telling people about what happens to stormwater. So yeah, I think many different ways. Doesn't come cheaply, but just needs to be done because paint and the like getting into waterways just it's not a good thing.
Thank you, Chris. Your submission time's concluded. Our final submission that we're hearing today is submission number 10 from Rangitane o Manawatu. We've got Thomas K online. This is submission, this is on page 42, councillors.
Rangitane o Manawatu, we've got Thomas K online. This is submission, this is on page 42.
Can we just get Chris to mute, thanks, so we don't get that feedback? Excellent. Kia ora koutou, ko Thomas tōku ingoa. I'm here on behalf of Rangitane o Manawatu. I'm a policy advisor at Kahu Environmental with background in ecology and environmental science. I'm just going to jump straight into it since there's limited time so that you can have any questions if you like. I think Palmerston North City Council has done a reasonable job here at rehashing the Stormwater Bylaw, but I think the approach has been relatively traditional, for want of a better word. It feels like you've kind of stuck to the format and the minimum requirements of the legislation, and kind of just updated what was already there. There's some significant shortfalls, I think, that have been missed that you can address, which other councils have addressed and should give you the confidence to do so, particularly things like Te Mana o Te Wai and the concept. Apparently my camera's off, even though it is on. I'll try that again, but I'm just going to have to keep going anyway. Things like Te Mana o Te Wai, which is in the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, and recognition of that concept and how important it is to stormwater management since it's part of the freshwater system. And alongside that, things like the protection of river habitat, which has been kind of thrown under the bus a little bit here in the Stormwater Bylaw with the provision that landowners are required to maintain areas of stream on their properties for basically flood water movement, which is kind of goes against the provisions of the National Policy Statement, which talk about protecting habitat, and the RMA. So I think there's some considerations there, and I've provided some suggestions as to how to address them from the Hamilton City Council bylaw, but I think you could potentially go further than that if you wanted to. One other glaring thing that's missing from the PNCC version is recognition of mana whenua or tangata whenua, that role of kaitiaki in the freshwater space. It's hard to address this fully, I think, through the framework that we have in terms of how stormwater is managed and who it's managed by, but I know PNCC is working hard, particularly with Rangitane, on sort of partnership arrangements and things, and I think that recognition needs to be there as a minimum. It's not to say that this is what stormwater management should look like in the future for tangata whenua, but I think you need to make that nod in that direction, that recognition is there. Outside of those things, I want to just support a few of the things that the previous speakers have said, particularly Chris, around impermeable surfaces. I think there does need to be a limit on the size of impermeable surfaces on a property. There's obviously different ways that landowners can go about achieving that, but Chris listed quite a few. There's not only benefits for stormwater from that perspective, but also benefits for people's health. There's some international guidance around trying to get 30% tree cover across a suburb as being very good for people's well-being, as well as slowing down water through the system. So trees, not only does having grass and things help water recharge into aquifers and things, but trees and their leaf cover also hold water. And as Chris was talking about, eventually the systems in Palmerston North are going to become overrun by stormwater, and you've seen that recently as you put in more impermeable surfaces. The rivers are only going to hold so much, the flood protection systems you've got are only going to hold so much, and actually going towards a more natural system where there's more tree cover, there's more wetlands, water is slowed down, so it's not getting into rivers as fast, rivers are given more room to move, only then will you have a system that's really resilient. On that note, obviously flood-prone areas have been a problem for Palmerston North recently. I actually know someone who was affected very, very badly by the flooding. There are rules and other bylaws across the country that talk about not being able to build in flood-prone areas without permission from council, and not being able to extend properties in flood-prone areas in a way that is going to increase that susceptibility to flooding. So Palmerston North could absolutely introduce something like that to this bylaw as well. Finally, a few sort of minor things that could be changed quite easily. Things like car washing are prevented on the sidewalk, and putting soapy water from cars down into stormwater is prohibited in some parts of the country. I think Porirua might have been the first to do it. That's totally something that could be done. As to Chris's point around putting things down the drain, the time frame for building over stormwater pipes, that, you know, allowing 50 years worth of life in the pipe is just ludicrous. Basically, that's way too short. We need to be thinking much longer than that. And as Chris says, we actually need access to these pipes. So I live in Wellington. We see the problem of this every day. We've got pipes blowing up across the place, and access to them is a huge problem. And finally, that suggestion from Chris as well, that stormwater isn't treated before it goes to the environment. That's something we need to address in New Zealand. So overseas, stormwater is treated. The Great Lakes in America is an example. I can't remember which one it was, but there are some good examples from over there where lakes have been trashed by people through time, and as part of improving those lakes, stormwater is treated. And we absolutely need to change the way that we look at stormwater in New Zealand to bring it into that concept of te mana o te wai, that fresh water is important for everyone, that we need water to be going into our aquifers and our wetlands and our rivers, and that those systems need to be as natural as possible, and only when they are performing in that way will we have truly sort of resilient systems where we're not constantly fighting, again, as Palmerston North has seen, fighting to get water out to sea and to protect people from flooding. I'll leave it at that and take any questions if you've got them.
Thank you, Thomas. First question from Councillor Barrett.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Thomas. Just referring to the written submission, it seemed to lean quite heavily on Central Hawke's Bay district's examples, and just wondered why that was. Are they a sort of best practice across the country, or what was the rationale around having that heavy reliance on them as an exemplar of practice?
So Central Hawke's Bay was one of the most recent stormwater bylaw reviews that I'm aware of, hence the leaning on that there. They did some, what I thought to be reasonably progressive things, particularly around recognition of te mana o te wai and tangata whenua status in freshwater management. So that's why the lean was there. They're also redoing their district plan at the moment, which is including, it's only a draft, but it is including things like requiring on property water storage, which can be used for things like garden watering. You'd know that in Central Hawke's Bay, water is a prized commodity. So that district plan that's being shaped alongside is quite progressive. So hence the lean there. But other things were lean. You know, the Hamilton City Council one is reasonably progressive as well. I don't mean to say that those are the best. I think you could do something really wonderful in terms of water sensitive design and all that kind of thing. Obviously, the legislation and what you have to put into the stormwater bylaw might limit how far you could go, but I was just trying to provide examples of councils that have gone much further than you currently have, and encouraging you to keep pushing further, basically.
All right, thanks, Thomas. That clarifies that. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Thomas. There's no further questions at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you for your submission. So, councillors, we'll now look to the recommendations on page 15, noting I was supposed to move those before we heard submissions, so we're just tidying up the wording so that it makes sense. There we go. So I'll move that the Planning and Strategy Committee note submissions from presenters who spoke in support of their submission, and that the committee note the procedure for hearing of submissions as described in the procedure sheet. That is seconded by Councillor Hancock. Are there any comments? Okay, I'll invite you to vote. and that has carried 100%. We're now looking to page 7 to the draft Stormwater Bylaw summary of submissions, and we have got Julie McDonald online. Is it?
Kia ora koutou, councillors. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, thank you, Julie.
Happy to present this memo, receiving the submissions and noting that the report will come back in April for your consideration of the final form of the bylaw. We've obviously received a small number of very well thought out and considered submissions, which will be very helpful in the final deliberations report.
Thank you, Julie. We've got a question from Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Julie. Julie, in 2.2 you list the consultation activities, and I see that you did directly contact some property owners, those who are likely to have on-site private stormwater system. Was any attempt made to contact property owners who would be affected by the maintenance of stormwater drains provision?
I'm probably not really able to answer that in a lot of detail. I guess I just note that extensive efforts were made to contact the most people who would be most affected by bylaw changes within the constraints actually of council's own systems. But I'm happy to provide to find that specific answer out and come back to you if that's going to be helpful.
I'm just not aware, and I'm not sure if other councillors are, how many properties we have in the city that might be affected by the provision to maintain the stormwater, the banks or the free flow of water through the stormwater drain on private property. I mean, do you have an idea of numbers even?
So some of that information was provided in the earlier report where the draft bylaw was proposed for consultation. But when we bring back the deliberations report, there'll be a consideration of the extent of impacts, but there'll also be a discussion of how the various mechanisms that govern stormwater fit together. So, for example, the framework that's going to be developed and also the district plan provision. So some more of that information can be repeated and expanded upon in the deliberations report, but I don't have those specific details in front of me now.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Julie. Just to the points raised by submitters around involvement with Rangitane, you do indicate here that there has been some discussion there. I'm just wanting to know, will there be further engagement with them on this matter before we see the deliberations report, given the nature of submissions?
Without wanting to speak for other officers, I guess it will depend a little bit whether there's further clarification required. I mean, I think today's presentation of the submission has been very helpful, but yes, we would always engage with submitters if there was further information needed or we were wanting to follow up to make sure we understood really clearly what the points that they're wanting to make, and that holds for any submitter. Because this submission came late, I know that there's some more discussion has been going on about it.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks, Julie. There's no further questions for you. So I will move that the committee receive the memorandum titled Draft Stormwater Bylaw Summary of 9 February 2022, and that the committee note a late submission received from Rangitane or Manawatu will be included in the deliberations report. Seconded by Councillor Hancock. Are there any comments? Great, I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. Moving on to the confirmation of minutes from the 8th of December 2021, page 53. So I'll move that the I'll move the committee resolve that the minutes of the Planning and Strategy Committee meeting of 8 December 2021, Part 1 Public, be confirmed as a true and correct record. Seconded by Councillor Hancock. And Councillor Bowen. Thank you. For the record, Councillor Bowen has just pointed out a discrepancy with a double arrival. We will go back through and tidy that up. Are there any other comments? So we'll just add on that amendment at the end. And I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. Moving on, our next item is the draft Trade Waste Bylaw 2022 summary of submissions, and we have got Julie McDonald back online. We've just exited our meeting, so we'll just pause for a moment while we rejoin. David Murphy's going to step in for Julie.
Kia ora koutou, councillors. So we'll obviously the draft trade waste bylaw summary of submissions report will take as read. If there are any questions, I'll attempt to answer them, or otherwise we may well have Julie or Peter back online shortly.
I'm hoping someone's got a good question for David. Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, David. My question just relates to the consultation aspect of it. And I note there's actually quite a low uptake in terms of the Facebook and very low number of people who have actually delved into the topic of in any depth. Just wondered if you could comment on that.
No further comment other than that we followed the consultation process that we typically would, and it may well be an issue that's difficult to conjure up interest.
Yeah, I suppose when I look at the stormwater consultation through Facebook, we got quite a good hit on that.
Is this a question, Councillor? Or would you like to save it for comments?
No, it's a question.
Okay.
So is there, do we actually go back and actually have a look at that and do some analysis in terms of why there might be so?
In terms of the different feedback on the different bylaw issues, or the feedback that's provided via Facebook on the draft trade waste bylaw?
Yeah, just in terms of the difference between the two.
I think we're continually reviewing our consultation processes and looking at projects where there's a greater uptake and less of an uptake. I think stormwater is probably more in your face, an in your face type issue than trade waste bylaw in terms of it's visible to a number of owners. landowners, so you would typically expect a greater response to an issue like that versus trade waste bylaw.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks, Madam Chair.
We've got a question from the Mayor. I might just double check. Sarah, have we reconnected? I suspect we might need Julie to answer the Mayor's question because I have a feeling what it is.
I have arrived back.
Perfect. Mr. Mayor.
Cyberspace.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Sorry, this is working half the time. So my question follows on from Councillor Hancock's. I understand we have many dozens of trade waste customers. We've got 7 submitters. Did it go to everybody? Did the consultation go to everybody? Bearing in mind we are significantly changing things. It just seems really strange that we've got 7 submitters and nobody wanting to speak to us with quite big changes.
Okay, so kia ora koutou, my apologies. I think we were all thrown off the meeting and then are back on now, so I've only heard the Mayor's question. Peter is in the meeting too, and I think he's come back as well. So he can perhaps elaborate on some of the details that are provided in the report about the level of engagement that has occurred during the development of the bylaw.
Yes, kia ora koutou. I was also thrown off the meeting, so I didn't hear Councillor Hancock's question either. But to answer the Mayor's question, we definitely did contact all of our trade waste customers. I think it was, many hundreds. I can't recall the exact number off the top of my head. As to why we only received a small number of submissions, it's a tricky one to answer because we often have the situation where the level of engagement isn't as high as we would like. But I think the submissions we have received show a general level of support for what we're proposing, and I would characterise the changes we're making are relatively modest. One of the more substantial changes around controlled trade waste only applies to a small number of existing trade waste customers. And the other change around, for instance, permanent sink screens has been made a discretionary rather than a mandatory requirement, so the impacts here again are relatively minor.
Okay, thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Peter and Julie. There's no further questions. So I'm happy to move that the committee receive the summary of submissions to the draft Trade Waste Bylaw 2022, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Thank you. Are there any comments? Great, I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 14 in favour and 1 abstention. So moving on to the submission to the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Amendment Bill, Huia Street Reserve. We've got Jono Ferguson-Pye speaking to that. Jono, do you want to come and join David up the front?
Morning to the Mayor, Chair and Councillors. Look, just before I start, if I'm slurring my words, apologies. I've just had some dental work done, so I'm just getting used to some metal work in my mouth. So apologies. I haven't been drinking. So just here to talk to the draft submission on the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Amendment Bill. I won't be long. Essentially, I will take the memo as read and the draft submission as read. Probably the next thing I'll just draw your attention to is recommendation 2, that the draft submission be approved by the Mayor under delegation, as there's insufficient time for the submission to be referred to Council to approval. The submission is due to the Select Committee by the 18th of February, so we just unfortunately haven't had time to get the submission approved by Council at this time. Secondly, I guess I've picked up on this project as recently coming into the City Planning Manager's role. If there are any questions relating to previous conversations that I wasn't at Council or wasn't involved in, I'll just defer to David if that's okay. Certainly have read all the reports and use that to inform the draft submission. Lastly, any issues that you do discuss that are raised here, obviously we can put those into the submission if the committee thinks that's appropriate. We've done that fairly regularly in the past, so that wouldn't be out of the ordinary. So with that, Madam Chair, I'll hand back over to you.
Thanks, Jono. We have a question from Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, John. On a couple of places on these papers, it is described that the land, according to 1922 Act, this land cannot be sold. It's particularly cannot be sold. Can it be developed, though, or redeveloped?
Councillor Butt, so the legal advice we've had is that the amendments that we're seeking to the legislation are required if the council wanted to develop the land for housing or sell the land for housing. So regardless, so the amendments are required to, I guess, release the land from some specific legislation that doesn't allow it to be developed for housing or sold for housing. So I guess the key point is, if the council wanted to develop the land for housing or sell the land for housing, the same amendment is required to the legislation.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and this question somewhat relates to the answer to the last in terms of the way that Mr. Murphy described the draft is with an or in terms of council development or sale, and just wanted to confirm that there is a viable path to a housing outcome if we do own the land.
So could you just repeat the last part of your question? I didn't quite...
Just wanted to have your confirmation that there is a viable path to achieving a housing outcome if we own the land.
A viable path?
Yes.
We have a workshop scheduled for later, I think it's in March, around housing partnerships. So one of the things we're seeing is the delivery of housing, whether it's by council or in partnership, can be delivered through a range of different models. Each provider, whether we're doing it, obviously if we're doing it ourselves, clearly holding the land and not selling the land is something we could do like we did at Papioa Place. If we were wanting to partner, certainly the indications we're getting from the housing partners is that there's a range of different models that they would use. Some involve them owning the building, some involve them buying the land. So the advice to council at the time the council deliberated on submissions was, given that the same change to the legislation is required as to whether council is going to develop or sell it, and that in terms of keeping options open, the recommendation was to proceed with the necessary amendments to enable the sale or development. So the submission is very clear that the council has not made a decision about whether it's going to develop or sell. So developing or selling is still an option for council. I think the key thing for Parliament is development or sale requires the same, as I said earlier, the same amendment to the legislation.
Thanks. Just to follow up then, is it necessary that we open the door to both to achieve either of them?
The legal advice that I've received, and I checked last night, is that if we want to develop or sell, the same amendment to the legislation is required.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Question to the paragraph in the submission about consultation on page 72. The first paragraph says 80 submissions received on the proposal covered a range of topics. Was there some reason why there wasn't a bit more of an analysis of 80 submissions, X in favour, X against? You know, it's not really, I don't think that gives a real flavour of the community feedback we received when we did go out for a submission process.
Thanks, Councillor. Look, I guess when I was summarising what had happened and the process we'd gone through, I wasn't trying to get into too much detail, but I agree with you. There could be a change made there if councillors felt that, I guess, the nature of the issues raised and the nature of issues and support and against, if you felt that would add useful information for the select committee to consider, then that would be something we could quite easily do.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I'm aware that the last time this went down to Parliament, we had residents from the city that went down to the select committee to present, and if our submission doesn't reflect the fact that this is a contentious issue, I'm concerned that it could give the perception that we're not being upfront about the fact that there was opposition if we just put this in the submission, I guess.
Is that a question?
Well, it is a question, because the question is, are we exposing ourselves to risk by not being clear about the fact that there was opposition to this proposal? That's the question.
Just, I think it would be transparent to add a paragraph around the nature of the submissions, and as we said, the Mayor will ultimately, because of the timing, have the delegation to approve the submission, so that may be something he wants to consider. But certainly our advice is, I think, would be transparent to add a paragraph or two around the nature of the submissions.
Okay. So I do have a follow-up, Madam Chair, then, based on Mr. Murphy's answer. So, are you suggesting that the contents of the submission are entirely at the Mayor's discretion?
So the delegations state that a submission that goes to a select committee must be approved by the full council, and if the timing does not allow, it's approved by the Mayor under delegation. So the situation we have is that submissions close on the 18th of February before the council meeting. So under the delegations, the submission will have to be approved by the Mayor. For transparency reasons, given we knew it was a sensitive topic, we brought the submission to this committee for discussion, which would allow the whole of the council to have a transparent discussion around the nature of the submission. But ultimately, under the delegations, the submission will have to be approved by the Mayor in order to meet the deadline.
Right. Thank you for clarifying.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this report. I might actually turn this off because it's easier. In terms of the original, I guess, recommendation to council, what we the wording of that was to enable the development of Hoya Street Reserve for housing, including the potential for a mixed-use housing development containing supporting recreational and small-scale commercial activity, is my understanding. But the preferred option that we've written in here stops at development of the Hoya Street Reserve for housing. And I was wondering why that hasn't fully gone through.
You're correct. That was the resolution. So which part of the submission are you looking at there where it says?
So I'm looking on page 73 when it says rationale for the preferred option, and then it says the preferred option, and it says basically everything that we said in that up to full housing. And I was wondering if we should be saying actually the preferred option was that full sentence that we agreed to in council.
Yeah, I think what's happened here is that's the preferred option in terms of the statement of proposal, but you are correct that there was that addition, so I agree that should be added into, when the council deliberated on submissions, there was that balance about a mixed-use development, so yeah, that could be, I agree.
Cool. And my second question was around when we're looking at, I guess, analysis of preferred option. One of the things that doesn't jump out at me as much as I feel it should is the fact that that particular piece of land is surrounded by reserve and green space and that kind of thing. And I was wondering why we've taken a light approach on that. We have a sentence in there that says the land is located in a good location for medium density housing close to high amenity areas, services, and the central city, but we don't really push the point of there's what, more than 40 hectares of green space in that location. Should we be adding something in there? And do we need something officially here to be able to do that, or can you just add something in there?
Councillor, I think that would probably be a reasonable and logical addition to that part of the submission, yes.
Cool, thank you. Those are my questions.
Mr. Mayor, did you have a question?
Yes, look, just well, it's actually more of a comment, but I'll just say, I think it's appropriate to say it now. Look, I'm happy for the paragraph to be added around the submitter's context and the additions that were just discussed before by the officers, so if that makes the discussion somewhat easier.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Are there any other questions? Great, thank you, Jono and David. So I am happy to move that the committee receive the submission to the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Amendment Bill as attached to the report presented to the 9th February 2022 Planning and Strategy Committee, and that the committee note that the submission to the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Amendment Bill will be approved by the Mayor under Delegation Clause 192.6 of the Delegations Manual, as there is insufficient time for the submission to be referred to the Council for approval. And that the committee note that in accordance with Clause 192.6 of the Delegations Manual, the final submission will be reported for approval by Council at the next available opportunity. Seconded by Councillor Hancock. Thank you. And I guess just noting that with the third recommendation, obviously that will be to note the submission that would have at that point been made. Right, we'll open up for comment. First up is Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Reserving my right to speak to the overall recommendations, I do have a further recommendation that I'd ask for consideration of, which is seen on the screen now. And that is that the Council submission be revised to advocate that the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Amendment Bill be amended to ensure ongoing public ownership of the Huia Street Reserve land. I'd like to speak to that now.
Thanks, Councillor. That's seconded by Councillor Johnson, so that's now live, so you can speak to that.
Great, thank you. So asking for your support on this amendment, because in my view, it is the most certain way of actually getting to a housing outcome. So this isn't about the technicalities of language around disposal versus sale, as we've heard from legal advice. This is actually about making an additional commentary in the submission that signals a long-term intent around where we want to go here. If we don't take this path, what we end up doing is obviously opening the door for sale of reserved land. In my view, that's quite unnecessary. Plenty of precedent around councils achieving good housing outcomes when they own the land And if we think about things like long-term lease, we can actually work with and access private capital and commercial developers in doing that. So it's an unnecessary step to leave the door open for sale. If you think about it from a parliamentary perspective and sort of what they're up against, they've got sort of a case where our submission sort of asks them to create two rather large precedents. One around saying, yes, okay to go for housing, and the other one saying, yes, we're happy to sell reserved land. We don't really need to actually ask for that second precedent. And in fact, if we leave it in there, it will leave the bill quite vulnerable to attack from people that are concerned about precedent of loss of public land from reserves. So we have a much higher probability of actually getting to our end game if we actually take that criticism off the table at this point. It's unneeded. We can achieve a high-quality housing outcome in this location without asking Parliament to set a double precedent, and in doing so, leaving that bill open to probably quite a withering critique from those who are concerned about the sale of reserves land and the precedent that may be set there. So again, my long-term game around this is a high-quality housing outcome, and this is the best way to get there, so I'd ask for your support.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. As you all know, I did not support the original decision to request that the reserve status be removed from this piece of land. But nevertheless, that was the decision of Council. So taking a pragmatic approach, now we're in this position, I don't think it would be wise to open the door to sale of this land. Council may have considered that the land is surplus to requirements from a reserves perspective, but it certainly isn't surplus to council requirements full stop. We've got very many requirements that we can put the land to use for, and I think it would be foolish to go ahead saying that we're prepared to sell this piece of land because I don't think we can guarantee good housing outcomes or any other outcomes once the land is sold. And so I think we'd be in a much stronger position, as I say, given that the decision has already been taken to request the removal of the reserve status. I think we'd be in a much stronger position if we said that we intended to develop this land ourselves. And as a general principle, I think we should always be very, very careful when we're considering whether or not to sell strategic assets. And this piece of land is a strategic asset. It's in a very visible main road part of the city that people see as they come into town. It's next to a school. It's next to one of our largest reserves. And so I think we would be wise to retain a level of control over this piece of land and not open the door to the sale of it.
Thank you. I am going to oppose this recommendation. I am absolutely open to the option of retaining ownership of this piece of land in the long term. But I think that probably one of the opening comments from Councillor Barrett is where one of my concerns stems from, and that's the long-term intent about where we're going with this. So I actually think it's too early for us to make the decision around the ownership status of that. We are being, with this recommendation, we're being far more specific than the bill that we have put up to have this released from reserve land. And I think that we would look foolish turning up to Parliament making a submission that isn't actually in line with the full scope of what we've requested. It's now much narrower, and I think it's actually setting it on a slightly different course. So we've got multiple opportunities throughout this process to consider ownership status. And I think that at the moment it's actually just too early to be making this decision. I don't believe that there is a great level of risk by not making a decision at this stage. I actually think that, as I said, there's multiple points along the way that we can still determine what ownership looks like. But at this stage, I think actually it's too early to make this decision, so I won't be supporting the recommendation. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm very happy to support the first three recommendations as outlined in this report, and I believe that those recommendations reflect the agreed position of Council following a really well-considered debate. The fourth recommendation that has been presented to us today, I won't be supporting. I agree with the Chair's comments, but in addition to that, I believe that us proceeding with that fourth recommendation would preclude possible partnership options that may actually deliver desirable outcomes. And I think it would be overly restrictive for us to adopt this now. I think looking at historically, it's debatable whether council are the best equipped to provide the most cost-effective housing. And through partnerships, it may be that we can deliver more cost-effective outcomes for our community in terms of housing, so I would not want to preclude that option. And I think with the three recommendations that have been provided in this report, that does give us a pathway that's consistent with the decision that we have collectively made, and I also think that does allow us broader options for housing consideration in the future.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question to the mover and the seconder on number 4. You spoke about long-term leases to other, essentially, developers. Is that right? So, are we talking like, and it has happened in other cities, like long-term leases, like 99-year lease? Is that what you're talking about? On the land, so a developer comes in, develops the housing, we own the land. Is that what you're talking about?
In general terms, yes. Obviously don't have anything specific in terms of how long those agreements would be or what the terms of those agreements would be, but yes, long-term lease could be up to that long.
Right, okay. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to support the first three, but I certainly won't be supporting item number 4. I agree with the partnerships. We don't want to get ourselves in a position where we have an opportunity to put multi-purpose housing on that site. I mean, personally, I can see where we could have social housing, top quality housing, and mix it. And to do a site with that much housing, we'll be up for millions and millions of dollars, which council has not got on its 10-year plan. And we would be very short-sighted that if we could partnership, it may be with somebody like Rangatani, Kaingaroa, anybody, or private, that we could end up with excellent quality housing and reduce some of the waiting lists. And I certainly don't want to see that pathway, barriers put up for that pathway. And at this point in time, council is not selling anything, so we haven't made any decisions, so I just don't want any barriers put up to hinder us from going forward with increasing housing.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question probably I want to ask David regarding this number 4. Do you think if we say yes, if the council says yes to this amendment, will it delay the change of status at the Parliament?
potentially we would probably need legal advice on actually what is required to be, what words or drafting is actually required to the legislation in order to give effect to option 4. It may well be that it's given the way the existing legislation is drafted, it's very difficult to actually create a situation that actually gives effect to recommendation 4. So we would have to take legal advice because we would need to be very clear when we turned up to the select committee why we were now asking for something different, what that was, and how that was going to be given effect to in words. So we haven't taken legal advice on that to date, or the draft, or how that would be drafted, or if it could, given the way the two pieces of legislation have set up. So I think the best way to describe it is that option 4 has the potential to complicate what we would be asking the select committee to consider.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Are there any further comments? Mr. Mayor?
Sorry, this isn't working. My first one was really a question, but thank you, Councillor Barrett. We don't have the ability to develop this ourselves. I think that's quite obvious, and Councillor Beattie sort of outlined that. And although I have some real sympathy with what we're trying to do, I think we're probably doing this a bit quick and somewhat on the fly. Long-term leases do exist. I mean, we've got them in our own city. We've had Māori reserve land here for almost nearly a couple of centuries. And you can do long-term leases of 99, 100 years where, the city, or it's in public ownership, but it can be developed by a private or a large entity. This will be a $20 or $30 million development if we go down that medium density. We don't have the expertise as a council to do this, and with all due respect to the officers, this is more of a development type arrangement, and also the funds. We've got nothing in our LTP for this sort of work. So at this stage, although I have sympathy with it, I'm not going to support it, but I do think we need to tease this out in a better way going forward. So I'll support the first 3. I won't support number 4 at this stage, but it does have some merit at a later stage. Thank you.
Are there any final comments before I go to right of reply? Okay, back to you, Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to colleagues for both questions and comments around this. Just to respond to a few, again, principally this is around actually increasing our probability of success at Parliament. It's going from a frame where we're asking for 2 quite major precedents, one of which is sale of reserves land, down to 1 precedent, which is the one that we want, which is to add an additional purpose, one where housing could sit along the other sorts of purposes that are commonly held for public land. It's been really interesting to hear the number of people referring to partnership. Once you sell the land, like selling land is not a foundation for partnership. It's a transaction, the land's gone, and all you've got is the district plan. Well, how well is the district plan working out in terms of delivering these sort of housing outcomes? If we actually want partnership, we need to keep skin in the game, we need to keep leverage, and the leverage that we have is land. It won't need to cost us a thing. We can bring private developers, we can bring private capital through long-term lease, and we don't need to sell the land to achieve a housing outcome. By persisting with the submission as it is drafted, we create risk of additional critique at the select committee stage, which could jeopardize the entire outcome. So yes, it might take a little bit longer, it might be a little bit more complex, we might need a little bit more legal advice, but the chance of actually getting to the outcome that we need is there. And in terms of being timely or not, is it ever too early or too late to underscore the fundamental principle here around public ownership of this land? I say it's a good time to do that rather than to leave the door ajar for others to push through at some point in the future and potentially see loss of this land from the public estate. So I would again ask you for your support so that we can get to a high quality housing outcome at this location. Madam
Chair.
Thank you, councillor. So we are now going to vote just on recommendation 4 initially. And that has lost 5 in favour and 10 against. So moving back to the original recommendations 1, 2 and 3, is there anybody wishing to comment on those? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to ask for them to be taken separately. I think just number 1 separately. Thank you.
No problem. Great. No other comments. So we will move, we'll vote on recommendation 1 first. And that has carried 13 in favour and 2 against. Now voting on recommendation 2 and 3. And that has carried 100%. So moving on to the committee work schedule, and I'll hand it over to the Chief Planning Officer to provide any updates or make any comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No specific comments. We've added some dates in for a few TBCs, so happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I would also just highlight, in particular, probably item number 7. At our agenda meeting, I did request a bit more definitive timelines, which is why, while it's still a little bit vague, it's more specific than just the entire year. And so that was probably at my request, but thank you for that indication.
Yeah, just on that, I guess, with the waste, there's the, I better get the terminology right. We've got the, a series of things that need to happen in an order, being the waste assessment, the review of the waste management and minimisation plan, and then the bylaw. So we need to take a staged approach through those so that one's informed of the other. So while those dates look, you know, some time away for some of them, there is a requirement for that work to occur in order.
Thank you for that clarification. We do have a few questions. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just seeking clarification on item 5, which is the Civic and Cultural Precinct Master Plan Update Report scheduled for June. I'm just seeking confirmation that that will be June when we've just cancelled the workshop that was due to happen on that.
There will be an update report in June. We're looking at to reschedule the workshop to sometime in May.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
On the same subject, actually, number 5, is it possible that we just have a very simple update to understand what's actually happened? Because I understand quite a lot has happened, and I have no formal knowledge of anything, and I don't think my colleagues have either.
Okay.
Like next month, could we just have a one-pager which understands what's happened if contracts have been signed, which I believe they have, and what is happening?
We can provide an update. I know there has been updates in the CE's emails and also in the quarterly report on the project, but we can provide an update.
Okay, so can I just confirm that it'll have contracts signed, what is actually happening, etc.?
Well, the commentary in the quarterly report and the CE's update confirmed that URIP had been appointed to do the work together with some supporting consultants, so that has been communicated, but we can provide an update.
Sorry, David, with contracts, so we know so it matches LTPs and etc.?
We can provide that detail, yes.
Good, thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just to clarify your answer to the Mayor in regards to item 5, that you an update can be provided. I'm just wanting clarified that update will come to this committee, as opposed, because I think what's important is that there's publicly available information on progress, and certainly CE updates, I'm not aware whether that is information that we can share with our community or not. So I think it's really important, given that the direction was given in April of 2019, the lack of publicly available updates on this program is significantly lacking. So I would just want confirmation that update does come to this committee, including the scope of the project.
Okay. Just to clarify, I interpreted the request for an update as a more informal update. At the moment, the work schedule provides an update in June 2022, so we would be reporting an update to this committee in June unless there was a change to the work schedule. So I didn't hear the Mayor ask for an informal update. I guess that's why I've asked for the clarification. I would be interested in an update, even if it's a one-pager, to progress to date to actually come to this committee. I'd like to move that as a recommendation if there's a seconder, but I'm
quite
really
happy second it.
So that an update on the civic and cultural precinct master plan work be presented to the March Planning and Strategy Committee meeting, please.
The update that is on there for June is the interim update. What would look different from the interim update in June to the March update?
So what I'm asking for is an update on work to date. So I'm assuming that what we get told in June will be work to date till June or May, but I think it's important that there is a publicly available record for work to date.
Sure. Yeah.
Today.
No, I just want to be really clear so we know actually what's been requested. Great, that's been well understood. Did you want to speak to your recommendation now? Councillor, have you got anything further to add?
No, I think I've clarified.
Okay, thank you. Mr Mayor, are you in the queue on purpose?
Yeah, I am.
Cool, thank you.
Look, thank you to Councillor Naylor. Look, I do think Councillor Naylor's comments are pertinent. I mean, there has been a contract signed. As the Mayor, I'm not really sure what it is. And I'd just like that to be a bit more transparent. We have an LTP budget and we just need to know, I'm not really trying to tease out if any work's started. If it hasn't, that's fine. Just need to know what we're up for, what the community's up for, and just a bit more transparency about that, because to date I haven't formally been told a single thing. Thank you.
Right, we've got no one else in queue. Is everyone happy for those to be taken together? Oh, my apologies, Councillor. We might be having some issues with that. But if you'd like to make a comment.
No, I'm talking about another item. Is that all right?
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Do you mind if I bring it up now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, item number 10, investigate options for free bus service. It was brought up in June 2021, and it's looking like it's going to be brought up on the schedule on August 2022, which is a year later. I'm a bit concerned about the delay in this coming back to the council, and I'm just going to raise my concerns in the chamber that this is taking over a year to come back to us when it was brought up in June last year. So I'm just raising my concerns over this because it's quite an important point that was raised, so just wanted to know if there was a discussion over that.
I can provide some comment to the August 2022 date. So you'll see in the current position that we're collaborating with the Horizons Regional Council, who are responsible for delivering the urban bus service. They are investigating options for free bus fares as part of their review of the service, so we're working in collaboration with their staff. And there will be consultation undertaken on free bus fares as part of their work. So they're responsible for delivering the service, and we're working in collaboration with the work they're doing on the review of free bus fares for priority groups. And that work will be reaching a conclusion just prior to August 2022.
Have we determined what priority groups we're talking about?
I can't recall the conversation from a year ago. We can go back and check the minutes, but I'm sure there are priority groups in terms of...
Okay, thank you.
The original recommendation that came out of the budget, I believe, was moved from Councillor Barrett and did specify a couple of particular groups, so that detail will be somewhere. Right, do we have any further question? Mr Mayor.
Sorry to jump in again on, and this may be, I may have missed something. Is our information management project, is that coming through your committee or Finance Committee, and an update on that?
I believe that that's Finance.
Okay, cool, thank you.
It'll be on a work schedule somewhere. Right, so we have got 2 recommendations. Councillor Naylor, are you happy to move recommendation 1 as well? Mr Mayor, are you happy to second that? Great. So we'll move those together and I'll invite you to vote. And that has carried 100%. So that concludes our business today. Nō reira, na mihi nui kia koutou, ina mana, ina reo, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And I'll look to the Mayor, but we'll break for morning tea and our workshop will be in.